Hello everyone, we are going to talk today about democracy, plutocracy, oligarchy, democracy, all kinds of things, because sometimes terms are confusing. Many times we confuse, for example, human rights and civil liberties and so on. So I thought that I would try to define terms a little bit, especially with what is happening in the West now with elections, not only in the upcoming elections in the United States, but here in Great Britain, and what is happening in the relationship between people and governments and so on. So just to clarify terms, okay? Now, what is a democracy? Okay. If you look it up, it is a political system by which sovereignty resides in the people who will exercise it directly or through its representatives. So democracy can be direct or indirect. And even in larger countries, we might have direct democracy in certain areas, in certain issues. For example, your neighborhood club, when people actually vote directly. We don't need to go to Athens now, okay? But there are certain in your club, you vote directly for a decision, okay, like everybody else. Small assemblies of people. In larger communities, obviously this is unfeasible. So in practice, so democracy has to be indirect through representatives. So what we have is that democracy can have these two variables, direct or indirect, yes, through representatives, but always residing in the people. The will of the people is always to be respected. So in summary, government by the people, directly or indirectly. So in a country, for example, where human rights are respected, let us say, but it is not government by the people, that is not a democracy, even though they may respect human rights, okay? It can be something else, it can be a liberal regime, it can be whatever you want, but it is not a democracy. It is also possible that in a democracy, human rights actually are not respected overall, or at least some people are not respected. Okay, so there have been many regimes clearly oppressive with respect to some groups, minorities, slavery, colonial exploitation, etc. So one thing is, as we see, human rights. Another thing is the concept of democracy, although many times we confuse the two. Now, what is key here, when we say that the UK is a democracy, the United States is a democracy, you might be, or the opposite, that you are complaining and you're saying the UK is no longer a democracy, the United States is no longer a democracy. You might be actually complaining about the fact that once it was, but it has been degenerated to such an extent that now it no longer is. Now, let me give an example with the United States, for example. There is a famous portrait, a picture of, I think it was from 1787, and it is called the ratification of the Constitution. If you look at it, you can see that all the people depicted there are all kind of, well, at least the first impression is that they are all aristocrats, but they were not. So they're all certainly dressed in that fashion. Certainly they were not aristocrats, so they were very wealthy people. You can see that they're not ordinary peasants, okay? So what we have is the founding fathers of the Constitution were actually very wealthy people in the colonies. This doesn't go against them. You can have very wealthy people who are for the well-being of the country and all the people. It doesn't have to be a contradiction. But there is one question, nevertheless, to be asked. Can there be a true democracy when practically most of the representatives are much, much, much wealthier than everybody else, than the rest of the population? Perhaps, yes, but it is a question, yes. I say this because there is a quote here from Jefferson about republics and democracies. You might have already come across it. Quote, "A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. Keep this in mind, I'll come back to it. So the elites at that time were economic elites. They were wealthy, yes, and the colonies had felt continuously aggrieved. There was this ongoing tension between them, the upcoming merchants, yeah, and the back home in the English elites, who were at the time still very much aristocratic. Okay, a tension that existed also by now in Great Britain itself, because the merchants were coming up, business was coming up, the industrial leaders, and the aristocratic elite, based on military and land and so on. But in the colonies, this was sort of a double thing, because there were additional grievances, because they were in an area, in a zone, where, because they were colonies, they felt less rights than the metropolis, and they were physically also so far removed that the oppression felt, against the aristocrats was much more, the power of the aristocracy was much more difficult to accept than at home. So it was easier for them to rebel, to organize themselves in order to rebel against that aristocratic rule. And it is that rebellion which was both the colonies against Great Britain and at the same time merchants against the aristocracy that led to this question of challenging the political system from which they came, a monarchical system, yeah, traditionally very much linked at the time to the defense of the aristocracy. And this is what they wanted to break away from. The rich then were merchants, the first industrialists, who obviously saw themselves very much different from the aristocrats, who, as I said, had the power there was based on land. So these two classes are going to confront each other. The new upcoming rich merchants want to get rid of the aristocratic control, and so the war of independence is for them an instrument to bring that about. So now they had to create and constitute and come up with a new political system in which they detach themselves from the old system, the monarchy. That was monarchy for them. So in Great Britain, by that time, there was already obviously parliament, but the colonies also, parliament, but the colonies also had their own parliaments with their own powers of decisions. So what we now have is the major break has to do with the monarchy, with the king. What did that mean? It means that the political system they were going to build had to be a republic. a regime without a king, as republic as opposed to the monarchy. But republic is not necessarily a democracy either. Republic is a system without a king, but a system where we, not the king anymore, or the monarchy anymore, or not the aristocrats anymore, but we, the new merchants coming up in the world, we are at its head. The wealthy merchants, the merchant class, little by little more industrial powers, more financial powers, and so on. So they say, they are thinking at that moment that democracy is a barbarity. It would lead to chaos. No. Democracy, not necessarily. What we want to build then is a representative republic in the United States. Remember the quote again. A democracy is nothing, from Jefferson, yes? A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. But I want you to give this a different reading somewhat. Given the decision-making power of government to the mob, to the people, will mean chaos. They see clearly that the interests of the people in general are interests that are radically opposed to their own. So a democracy, no. A representative republic, yes. Representative of whom? One could argue representative of their own interests. So this takes us perhaps to the very origin of the US, which is a, if you want to say democracy, is a census democracy. A census. The right to vote is restricted to people with certain characteristics, and others are excluded. This is not only in the United States, it's everywhere, but I'm just putting the United States as an example. So women are excluded, slaves are excluded, but also people without sufficient means, without sufficient property, they couldn't vote. I believe in in Europe it was already the 20th century when everybody was allowed to vote regardless of property. So in other words, at this time the majority cannot vote. Okay, the wealthy are the ones who vote. So not a democracy. It's not government by the people. Yes. It's a government by those who can vote. A government by the owners of property and by the owners of wealth. There were different norms in different states, but or you can vote if you can pay taxes, also if you have property. So this, you could say, that is government by the rich, and that is a plutocracy, where the rich have the wealthy have a preponderance in the government of the nation, in the government of the state. Okay, this of course may lead easily to nepotism, the members of your family, the members of your club, and so on. Okay, but this is common throughout the world, but that is what it leads to. It would be a long race to universal suffrage, similar to those in the United States, similar to those of the European countries, little by little extending the voting rights to everyone, but it's going to be a long process. It's almost about 2 centuries in the US. As a matter of fact, in 1966, the Supreme Court actually in 1966 prohibited prohibited requisites of wealth and payment of taxes in order to vote in state elections. There were still a few states that had that constraint there, that if you didn't pay taxes or a certain amount of wealth, you could not vote. And this is in 1966. So very much, your vote very much depended on what level of wealth or lack of it you had. So this is a census democracy. So it went from census democracy to universal suffrage. But that universal suffrage had to be somewhat controlled. This is a key issue, because those who had the control, started accepting little by little, progressively, the extension of voting rights to new groups, until, little by little, until you have universal suffrage all round. Now, it's a question here. If they had the power through the census, why did they accept this extension, this evolution, this extension of being able to vote to the general public? It would be like shooting themselves in the foot, as it were. Why did they accept that? Well, the large property owners realized that they could actually extend the right to vote to new groups without losing control of power. And this is, again, a key issue. They could extend it without losing the control of the top. So sometimes we identify universal suffrage with democracy, but it might not necessarily be the same again. Universal suffrage means that all citizens have the right to vote, but that they, the ones who had the power and the control, now continue to control during 2 centuries to when universal suffrage comes along. But do they continue to control even with universal suffrage? And so here we have to distinguish, democracy, we know representative democracy, we have census democracy. Now there is another word, plutocracy. Democracy we know is government by the people, for their interest. Plutocracy is government by the rich few, for their interests. There is a famous cartoon of the Supreme Court of the United States in the middle with the scale of justice and so on. And here you can see millions and millions of people who are poor up here. And here down below you see 3 or 4 or 5 rich billionaires, and they actually weigh more than the millions of people here, you see. So this is what they were trying to portray, that wealth and power and so on can actually, control, what am I saying? A few wealthy will have much more control and much more power than millions of people over there. And I said how, why is this going to be, even though the people are very, greater in number? Well, we're going to see how elections are going to be conducted. We're going to see the lobbies. We're going to see the super PACs who give money to this and not to those. Okay. So the Supreme Court actually, there was a case, I don't know, perhaps 40, 50 years ago, not long ago, where people were trying to control the donations. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the donations of to certain politicians and so on, the lobbies and the super PACs and so on. And they were trying to control that. It was very much on the political air. There are people discussing it. The financing of political campaigns. And the Supreme Court actually decided that it would go actually against human rights to restrict the rights of financing campaigns by the super PACs. Okay, so they're going to have, how do they keep control of the power? Well, they're going to have the financing of elections amongst other things. The lobbies, the pressure groups. Don't confuse a lobby with a pressure group. Well, lobbies sometimes can be informational. If you have a lobby of the medical association, part of its function is to write reports and inform politicians and teach politicians about things that they might not necessarily obviously know about health. So there they are helping you about, if you're thinking about doing this, what would the consequences be and so on. Okay. But they also have another side to it, and that is that they are always going to put their own interests there. So, look, is there any country that we can say is a democracy in the world? Well, probably not. But in the government, in a given government, they're always, in indirect democracy, they're always going to be intermediaries, the instruments of intermediaries, which form and sometimes deformed and informed popular opinion. You're going to have to be you're going to be able to vote, yes, but I may keep control because I can condition public opinion. We have to demystify a little bit some countries that call themselves democracies, and they go around exporting democracy around the world. They're handing out cards. You are a democracy, you are not a democracy. I don't know, perhaps they exported it so much that they had nothing left themselves. But in any case, okay, so we know now a plutocracy, yes, a few rich, powerful people. Oligarchy. Oligarchy, very, very similar, is a form of government in which political power is exercised by a small group, a small group of people. Okay, it could be that they're not the wealthy. It could be that it is some sort of other grouping. They're very interconnected, oligarchy and plutocracy. Government by the few of the wealthy, oligarchy, plutocracy, but certainly not a democracy, which is government by the people. So let's associate these two things now, plutocracy and universal suffrage. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was really the expectation there that the universal suffrage would actually bring about the government by the people, in favor of the people, at any rate. Hence the rise of social democracy. This was very important to differentiates itself from the revolutionary labor working class Marxist movements. In other words, since we are much greater in number, we are the workers, the Labour government in Great Britain, the Fabian Society, since we are much greater in number, then obviously through universal suffrage, we are going to gain power. So therefore, we really don't need to start making a revolution, violent revolution anywhere. We just have the vote. So much greater in number than those few over there, so we'll gain power. Universal suffrage, therefore, was seen as the form for the many to gain power. But this was probably an era of social democracy in not understanding or not wanting to understand, or leaving aside the fact that it's not actually the vote, but is the control that you exercise over the people who are going to vote. Look, there is a Louis D. Brandeis, judge. He said, I'll give you another quote, in the United States, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. Now, think about that. So, in order to keep control and to keep power, and at the same time allow universal suffrage, obviously those in power, the wealthy, let us say, have to be able to control universal suffrage. It is possible to guarantee that citizens, if you know how to do it, that citizens will vote as the wealthy want them to vote, not necessarily according to the people, their own interests, thinking that they are voting in their interests, but in fact voting for the interest of those who rule. So, because you can control it in many different ways, they would have no problem from the 19th century onwards to, let universal suffrage come about. But how can you control universal suffrage? How can you control people voting as you want them to vote? How can you control universal suffrage? Well, you can think of many ways. Okay, let's start with public opinion. How they will vote in the short term and in the long term by controlling the ideology, the values, the way of thinking. Yeah. You can control also this universal suffrage. We're going to look at each one in detail with electoral campaigns, how they are conducted. Let's controlling governments and so on. Let's look at public opinion first. In order to control public opinion, you have to be able to control the media, which is the means of communication, in order to construct this public opinion. And we see, certainly from the 90s, how it has been concentrated. There used to be many companies in the media. It has been concentrated now in the United States to 6 major companies. Yeah, it is very well structured, okay, but within this public opinion thing, you have to have a certain degree of allowing to be for some people or for some media to say left and right and left and more liberal and more conservative. Okay, not just one discourse or narrative, as it's called today. Allow a certain degree of variety, so I, as an individual, can vote for this party, not that one which is different. Okay, and I think that I am sort of expressing my own opinion in my own interest. What is lacking here is that both this and that and that and that are actually controlled also to make sure that they do not deviate right, left from the interests above. With the advent of the internet, at the very beginning, they were very much aware that this was going to be a little bit of a risk. And so the great corporations and the intelligence agencies actually created, to begin with, these huge, massive internet companies in order to at least have some degree of control over the population. Okay, so you have to, through the media, in many sorts of ways, you can construct public opinion. Another way is through the culture industry. Think of Hollywood. This is more not just to control your vote, as it were, but more in the long terms of creating long-term values. It may be even generational. Yes, how you think about things in the long term. Obviously in education, and in the United States, especially with private universities, this is very much so. You also have to be able to control your political and social leaders, be it through incentives or threats. More about that in a second. And at the moment we see foundations and NGOs financing the financing of popular organizations and so on. In other words, you have to control ultimately so that people vote not against their interest. You have to be able to control their values, the ways of thinking, in order to control the vote indirectly. How do you control elections? Well, there are differences here, aren't there, between, say, the United States political parties and those in the UK. The political parties, believe it or not, in America are much weaker. In other words, they come together at election time, which more and more election time is ever present. But it is the individual representative, the individual person running for office is actually much more independent than what they are, for example, in Britain, where the parties are strong. Yeah, so you finance the political party. In America, you finance the individual. There's a certain degree of autonomy here within these two huge umbrellas, the Republicans and the Democrats, but nevertheless, the individual candidate has a certain degree of more independence than the people who stand for office here in the UK. Well, for that, you are going to have to be financed in America. You can be as independent as you want, but if you're not a millionaire, a multimillionaire yourself, you're going to have someone side by side with you. you need a lot of financing to be elected. So that personal dependency on financing and on donors is enormous. So you have to be helped. And you have to be helped by whom? By great corporations, obviously. How do you control the government? So what you have now is that submissive politicians, you end up with submissive politicians because of the need for financial help in order to finance their future campaigns. You have the revolving door, yes, where we're talking here about the industrial military complex and it's not only the military anymore, but it was originally the generals who then go to work for these great armament companies and so on. They keep going from public to private to public. The weight of the media, obviously, and more we see something perhaps much more sinister in the trafficking of sometimes not only interest, but sometimes human beings, sometimes to do with quite sinister, new form of human slavery. And it has been said that a lot of politicians in some sort of sinister way could actually be blackmailed because they have taken part in certain things. You all know what I'm talking about, certain things that now they've got them and they will have to continue to vote in this particular way. I don't know whether, I'm sure there are one or two cases like that. I don't know how extensive that is. It seems to me a little improbable that, the majority of them would be in these situations. But it has been suggested that it's not actually blackmail as such. It comes before. In other words, you're going to be one of us, and in order for us to be sure that you are going to continue to be so, you have to enter into this kind of behavior. That is your way of showing us that you will be on our side, kind of thing. That seems perhaps a little bit going too far, but it's just a way of explaining how sometimes we see politicians that are obviously not working for the interests of their country or even of their party, and nevertheless keep voting in this fashion. And we pull our hair and said, but why? Can't he really see that? And here are, different ideas about what have they got on him, the powerful ones. Okay, so let me summarize all this. Okay, so look, that our politicians at the moment are controlled by powers that may not be working necessarily to the interest, in the best interest of the people, I think is now apparent, and it's becoming more and more obvious. I don't want to go into far-fetched theories about anything, but my question is, because it is so evident now, what can we do about it? I would welcome comments. I can't be the only smart ass here suggesting things, but I'll give you an example. Coming to the UK, okay, to the situation here, these demonstrations out in the streets and so on. I wanted to react almost immediately to what I saw. To me was clear and evident, but then I thought, no, don't. I was going to talk about it, what I thought of it all. But then I thought, no, because when you react immediately, you could be terribly, terribly wrong. You don't have all the facts, you don't have a lot of things. So perhaps it's better to wait a little to see how things developed and so on. But I actually haven't changed my mind. I could have said this, a week ago. There's this gentleman whose AKA is Tommy Robinson, okay? Now, this gentleman has been for a long, long time bringing out certain abuses that were being made by some sections of society, and that he felt very strongly that they were not being addressed by the police or by the government and so on. And pre-COVID, you couldn't even mention their names because that was racist or, whatever. So the media wouldn't even give him any rope, it was just, some fascist, some person there who was far right and so on. Everyone is being far right now, but so they stopped whatever he would try to do or say. It was immediately stopped. A lid was put on it almost immediately. So he wasn't certainly very popular with the media or with the powers that be. And then almost all of a sudden, this initial incident happened here with the 3 little girls and, killed and so on. And all of a sudden, he was able to amass this following of people reacting and people in the streets following him and so on. And I thought, that is peculiar. What happened here? He was practically silenced before, and now he's actually allowed to have these huge demonstrations. Of course, the powers that be would be saying there, what a terrible thing, terrible thing, terrible thing. But nevertheless, they didn't stop it as they did previously. Some say that the media almost encouraged it. It was a sort of this is very peculiar. And then we find that this gentleman sort of went away or disappeared. Anyway, he ended up in Cyprus. I saw in a video that he was in a 5-star hotel, sunbathing and so on. That is what I saw in the video. It could be a fake one, I don't know. But my question is, what happened? What changed? That he was always silenced, and now he was almost encouraged, as it were. Or at least the movement and the reaction that he created was. This to me shows that what is now called this controlled opposition. That sometimes we find, and I'm not speaking about this particular gentleman now, just generally speaking, that sometimes we are presented, sometimes by populist leaders, who, because they have a background of being for the people and so on, that they lead, but at one particular point, some of them, I'm not referring to this gentleman, but some of them actually flipped. Something got to them. And I'm not talking about brown envelopes or anything as crass as that. But it could be like something, look, we know that you feel very strongly about this, and, we are going to allow you to continue doing it, and that you are reasonably successful. And the gentleman or the lady would say, oh, that's great. But he or she may not realize that he is being used for other motives. I wouldn't put it beyond rationality, reasonableness, if that word exists. That it was encouraged because in this particular case he was very much against one group of people, that it would be beneficial for the whole country to react against them. Perhaps because, let us say that what is happening in Israel and so on, and too many people were perhaps feeling sorry for what is happening to the Palestinians, blah, 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 and so on. And the general reaction was to feel for them and so on. And that had to be changed. And so this particular person who was always against these same people, now was allowed, in order to generate this antipathy to that same group of people. Do I make myself clear, speaking in sort of semi-codes here? So another way of controlling the population is by what we now call controlled opposition, which to an ordinary person who goes to work every day and is not paying too much attention may not necessarily be aware of. And I come back to the same question: how do we change this? I'll have to think about that. And perhaps I'll do one video about how to start changing. It will have to be through very, very small steps, I think. I welcome your comments. Bye-bye.